Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. There's a great story about a man who went to a Target outside of Minneapolis, demanding to talk to the manager. My daughter got this in the mail. She's still in high school, and you're sending her coupons for baby clothes and cribs. Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant? Poor manager didn't have the slightest idea what the man was talking about and apologized profusely, so much so that he even called back a few days later to apologize again. But this time, the dad took a really different tone. I had a talk with my daughter. Turns out there's been some activities in my house that I hadn't been completely aware of. She's due in August, and I owe you an apology. I don't know whether this story is true or not, but it really perfectly captures the idea that by collecting enough data, companies can gain real insights into our behavior that even we may not be aware of. With me today to discuss this potential, but also the pitfalls of big data, is Brad Love, professor of cognition and decision sciences and a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome to Changing Minds, Brad.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here.
I'm really pleased that you could join us. So before we get started, I'd just like to invite our audience that if you have questions for Brad as we go along today, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them in the last part of the episode. So Brad, maybe the best place to begin is to sort of note that companies probably have been collecting data for a long time. I'm thinking about insurance companies in particular, but maybe others. So I assume this isn't really new, right? When did supermarkets and retailers and Facebook take it to a whole different level?
Right. So since forever, companies have been interested in who their customers are and what drives them. So you're right there. And you're also right mentioning taking it to a new level. So what's going on now is quite different than an insurance actuarial table. The goal now is to develop an individualized model for each consumer in real time. And so the early leaders in this were in the 80s and 90s when things started going electronic, were like airline frequent flyer programs, and as you mentioned, supermarkets. And the UK was at the forefront there, with Tesco working with Dunnhumby, a data science company that I collaborate with, launched the Tesco Club Card nationwide. And so now, they get like 1.5 billion rows of transactions every 4 weeks. So they have like a long history on people, and like you said, know an awful lot about people through their decisions, through their purchases. And also, as you mentioned, the new tech behemoths like Google and Facebook, that's basically their whole business, is to collect information about us and try to make sense of who we are.
Well, there's this phrase that you hear, right? That data are the new oil. And notwithstanding the fact that oil's not doing so great at the moment, how is that true? I mean, what is it that they can do with these data, and how do you take 1.5 billion records and turn it into something useful?
Yes, as you think, it doesn't always go so smoothly. So of course, you want to get insight into like who the consumer is. So maybe like Tesco, for example, wants to know, are you a budget shopper? Do you like making dinner from scratch, and so on, to better serve the customers and make relevant offers to them. But of course, data itself doesn't solve the problems. The process could go horribly wrong. The early days, like even Amazon's recommendation systems weren't so great. So, you might be purchasing a 20-pound laptop carrying case, and as you're checking out at the last second, it's like, oh, would you also like to buy a 2,000-pound laptop? Nobody ever, in the last second of a 20-pound purchase, ups to a 2,000-pound, purchase. But what's going on there is just a correlation in the data that people tend to purchase these things together that the system picked up on. But of course, that correlation is not relevant in this context of going from a 20-pound purchase to a 2,000-pound purchase. More recently, just before the start of lockdown, I purchased some new trainers, and somehow Facebook tracked it, and I don't know how. And all I saw were ads for trainers, but of course that's the last thing I want. I just purchased the trainers. So it doesn't always go right. Maybe a more humorous example would be when Microsoft launched this chatbot named Tay, and the idea there was that it would learn through interactions with people on Twitter. And so people knew this. And so when you have this kind of reactivity, and when people know you're collecting data on them, odd things could happen. So within hours of this, that chatbot launching, was supposed to have this inquisitive teen girl personality. Trolls, like, through discussions with her, gave her this personality of being a racist neo-Nazi that was very happy to share her views on a range of issues. And so within 16 hours of being born, Tay was retired. See, maybe more seriously, if you think of predictive policing as sort of a hot topic, and the idea there is that limited policing resources are devoted to like crime hotspots. And it sounds like a great idea, but it kind of assumes the data are not biased. And of course, the data are biased, and the police themselves are part of the system, right? So if you send more police to an area, you're going to find more crime. So there could be this self-reinforcing cycle. And a lot of the systems that are deployed aren't taking into account, those very, basic principles of the reactivity. So really, like, where I think the data science flourishes is when you have continuous monitoring of like the consumer, but they're not really that aware of it, or it doesn't affect their behavior. So a great example is Netflix recommendation systems within their app. So, I mean, maybe people remember 10 years ago, there was actually this Netflix challenge, which was a $1 million prize for anyone who could improve their recommender system. And someone actually did win that prize, but Netflix never implemented it because that prize was launched in the day of DVDs being sent to consumers. And so in those old days, Netflix didn't actually know what their consumers were doing. They didn't really know if you watched that DVD or not. But now with their all online in their app, they know what you actually like. They could tell what you watch when you stop a movie after 2 minutes. So you might think you're going to watch, Schindler's List, but you're probably watching The Hangover or something. And Netflix knows who you are, even if you don't. So like that's a good case of when you have, data on what people are actually doing, not what they say they're doing, and it's in real time, and they don't really feel like they're being watched, or at least they're not that reactive to it. Like, people aren't going to watch different movies just because Netflix knows what they're watching.
I certainly remember Tay, the racist chatbot. That was quite an extraordinary example of AI gone a bit awry in the real world. So it sounds like just having the data and possibly these really clever learning algorithms isn't enough. You actually need to do something, say, smarter with it, and maybe try to narrow things down or apply some actual knowledge. I know you did a cool project with Tesco's dunnhumby. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, sure. We were interested in this issue of how do people explore and exploit options. So when you always say in a supermarket, purchase your favorite product, like your favorite beer, your favorite coffee brand, again and again, that's exploitation. That's purchasing your favorite. But of course, to find something better, you need to explore and try something new. And so people need to balance their exploration and exploitation, but they also need to, like, it turns out, the time when they explore to get the best outcomes. And so we've learned that through laboratory work and just sort of mathematical analyses. And we wanted to test out ideas from the lab in the real world. Namely, we wanted to test out whether, as in the lab, do people, like, the more they exploit, does their tendency to explore increase? That's how it should have gone, according to the lab work and sort of normative analyses. Almost like you should get curious about what you're missing out on, and maybe you've changed or the world's changed. It turns out in the real world, when the choice options are products that are subjective, you can't really say one kind of coffee is better than another. You see the exact opposite pattern. So what happens is the more people exploit, the more they choose their favorite, the more likely they are to repeat that in their supermarket choices. And it's sort of self-reinforcing until they explore, and then the process restarts again. So there are sort of these cycles, but the cycles are kind of going in the opposite direction of the lab. And we thought that was really interesting. And like, our explanation was just that you, rather than your choices falling from your preferences, it could also go the other way around, that your preferences follow from your choices. So for example, if you consume something salty, you'll tend to like salty foods more. And you might also shift your attention to aspects of the purchase that favor it. So you're more likely to repeat it or one related in the future. So for example, if you purchase a candy bar, you might focus on the flavor and how satisfying it is, as opposed to the health or calories involved in it. Yeah, so we really like this project because it involves sort of linking ideas from the lab and then testing them out in the real world. And we learned something startlingly new, surprising. And the results are also useful practically to the company. So they never really thought about doing these kinds of analyses. And it was really just kind of coming from psychology that we wanted to try this out with their data. And it's very exciting, as a psychologist to do that, because you have hundreds of thousands of, people and many data points over years. You could really answer questions in a way you can in the lab.
Yeah, I can really see how that's a pretty excellent kind of opportunity, because as a scientist, we just don't have that kind of data in the lab. And it sounds like by actually looking at real world data, you actually came to a different answer. I mean, you got some new insight that wasn't obvious from the big data, and it wasn't obvious from the psychology in the lab. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's definitely correct. Like, yeah, no, it didn't work out, how we expected, but we learned a lot from it, and then, ran subsequent studies and made sense of it. And like, if we didn't come from this perspective from the lab, we wouldn't have even had these ideas to test out. So it's really showing kind of this virtuous cycle between laboratory theoretical work and real world studies and more data science oriented work. Yeah.
Terrific. And I love that idea that people don't choose what they prefer what they choose. Does that
Yeah.
happen outside of Tesco's?
Yeah, we think it does, and recently completed the cycle back to the lab and ran a study that involved a large number of U.S. citizens to see if this could play out in other domains, such as political choice. And so we tested out this simple model we had that basically you move to prefer what you choose and emphasize those qualities. And we looked at like something very different than the supermarket. We looked at political preferences. So we looked at 3 hot button issues: abortion, immigration, and trade policy, for which people have strong views. And we had people choose a candidate based on really superficial information. So just like, do you like cats or dogs? Spaghetti or pizza? Just the most ridiculously superficial thing. And so they voted based on just that. So that was like their choice, like analogous to purchasing a brand of coffee. And then the politician was randomly assigned a viewpoint, either left or right wing, on one of these issues. And it was just randomly assigned. And then we asked the people, the participants in the study, what their views were on these issues. And people moved amazingly towards the politician they voted for. So, so basically people align with their choice, to prefer it. So that's a clear case of preferences moving to be coherent with the choice. And it might explain some strange behavior we see around the world now, where you're like, how could people believe this? Or did they always believe this? Were they always like this? And maybe the answer is they weren't always like this. It's just they made their choice, to their politician, and then their politician did some things and they just conform to that choice. It's sort of like the preferences following the choice. So yeah, we think this is just everywhere when the domain is subjective. So, even though these are important issues like immigration, it's hard to say what's right or wrong. It's like a value choice. It's somewhat subjective, just like, what do you prefer to consume is somewhat subjective, as opposed to like, this just costs more than that. That's fairly objective. So in all those domains, we think that this is what goes on, that people's preferences, align with their choices, and they tend to attend to the aspects of that choice that favor it.
It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, because it's really counterintuitive. I
Yeah.
would think of course, I choose the things I like the best. I don't flip it around like that. That doesn't make any sense. But in hindsight, I can.
Yeah, it's crazy, but it's like I wouldn't believe it myself if it wasn't for both the lab studies and then just seeing it in hundreds of thousands of UK supermarket shoppers that aren't really doing it for me. That's what they just do.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, if I could just play devil's advocate there, because that's a really interesting, I mean, it seems like you use these data to develop this model to explain people's behavior. How do you know your model's right? How do you test that?
No, that's a great question. You always have to be careful of like tricking yourself in science and really testing what you believe and trying to triangulate like the truth from multiple angles. And that's what we try to do, going back and forth from the lab into the real world. But one study we ran in the real world, it was almost like an experiment in the real world that made me believe the results a lot more, was a coupon study we did with dunnhumby and Tesco, where we could see from following people's recent purchases whether they were in sort of an exploratory phase or an exploitive phase. And we could send them coupons that either matched being in an exploration phase, for something new, or an exploitive phase, they're for their favorite product, and look at the redemption rates. And we basically, could predict ahead of time who's going to return these coupons or not. And there was massive effects, of almost like double the rate, if you hit people in the right part of the cycle of expiration versus the wrong part of the cycle. So to me, that's good evidence. It's a fairly clean study. It's something that we didn't do using existing data. We predicted it ahead of time, and it involves people in the real world actually spending their money, behaving, doing things. So it makes me believe it more than maybe a potentially brittle laboratory study.
Yeah, that's certainly a sort of a compelling way of doing things. And also it gets away from some of the limits that, not only do we have small samples, but we tend to have really biased samples. I mean, we test college students for the most part, right? Whereas I assume that you just tested it in some market in the UK?
Yeah. I think the details I think it's for Nescafe and different coupons for different products. Yeah, we just tested it in the UK market, broadly. So luckily, basically it was sent to Tesco loyalty card customers. And because we could know what they recently purchased, we could predict ahead of time whether we think they're going to use this coupon or not. So it's kind of nice because we're not, it's not like the relying on the previous data, like that Amazon case where it's making this crazy prediction based on the correlation, and it doesn't know if it's really right or wrong until after. We're actually, testing something and just like you would in an experiment, and then making a certain prediction, and it's fairly clean and not, very confounded like when you just could observe things. And yeah, so it increased our confidence in what's going on. But notes that studies like the magic bullet, I only kind of believe this because we have the laboratory studies, we have the analyses, more mathematical analyses, and we have the real world data and these real world studies. And I think you have to put all these things together with a little bit of psychological theory or some insight into what people are doing to be on a certain ground.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because it does feel like there's a real sort of virtuous cycle here. On the one side, you have these companies with these incredible real world data sets about actually the way people behave. And on the other side, you have, some psychological knowledge and models about how people behave in, particular controlled environments. But what was really interesting, it was bringing those two things together, gave you insights that weren't there in either data set alone. And I think that that's got real potential. I wonder how often people are exploiting these kind of links between academics and industry to try to get these new insights.
Yeah, it really should happen more often. I mean, because even in our case, our initial predictions weren't actually right, but they were still useful. So just like you said, it wasn't really like the academics know everything and will do everything. And it wasn't like the industry knew everything either. They ended up learning something important from the project too, that in the end that was useful to them. So it was really putting together the two things, and it advanced sort of basic psychological theory, but it also enhanced the operation of the company. So yeah, it was a win-win, and it should happen more often. I mean, it's just, yeah, I guess there's practical barriers, but it'd be great if they were surmounted more often to make these kind of projects common.
Yeah, no, I could see that. And I could see how it would be challenging to do, but the benefits there seem really worthwhile. And the costs of getting it started seem to be outweighed by the potential benefits from it.
Yeah.
Brad, how common is the sort of big data approach? I mean, is the field saturated? Is everybody doing it? Or is there still room for people who are trying to get involved and get started going forward with it?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, yeah, so certainly there are amazing things going on some quarters of industry, but I mean, there's so much room for growth. I mean, I wouldn't say it's early days, but it's just not nearly saturated. Right now I'm doing a secondment at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Data Science and AI Center. And because of that, I've had the opportunity to talk with some large companies that are looking to up their game in regards to data science. And you'd be surprised that a lot of major companies, even in important sectors like banking, really aren't quite there yet. Not even in terms of the plumbing of data science, getting, not discarding data, having it organized, having it accessible by data scientists, as opposed to strewn across 6 legacy systems. And that's not even getting close to anything we talked about, incorporating insights from psychology, from behavioral science, into the analyses. So I think there's tremendous room for not just data scientists, but people maybe coming at data science from more of a behavioral sciences perspective to make a contribution and to be creative there.
That's actually pretty encouraging, because again, it flies in the face of my intuition. My feeling is, oh my, everybody already knows everything. But I'm glad to hear that there's more scope. Brad, if it's okay with you, do you mind if we open this up to some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'd love it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, the first question I have here is, dear Professor Love, do you think there's a way of overriding these kind of Netflix algorithms? I did try and type thumbs up at some random films that I don't normally like, but I didn't really see any observable outcome as a result.
You mean somehow like spoofing it? So there is this, sometimes, I think it is like a valid concern that maybe this question's getting at, that this idea of a filter bubble, that these recommender systems might just like keep feeding to you what you like, to the point that, but of course, we all want to grow and try new things. And so that's actually, an issue in a lot of systems, like in YouTube and how it recommends things. And they basically try to get around that by introducing some exploration, into their algorithms. So people, because we all change over the years and our interests develop. So I guess, I don't know. I mean, if you're trying to fight the Netflix one, hopefully it's designed so you don't have to fight it. But maybe I don't know if it's picking up on this randomness. I bet it actually cares not about the ratings. I mean, I don't know how it actually works, but I bet it's mostly based on what you actually do. So maybe you have to put that movie on and like the film on and leave the room, so it thinks you actually watched it. Because that was the real insight from them not actually using this Netflix challenge prize, is that they don't need to know what you say you like or even what you order. Like back in the day of DVDs, they actually just look at, are you watching the thing? Did you stop watching the thing? How often did you pause it? So I bet that would be the way to spoof it if you wanted to. I mean, I don't know if it's desirable to spoof it, but I think you'd actually have to consume or have it think you consumed it.
I wondered if that wasn't, an effect here, in the sense that they're probably weighting what you do more than what you say when they're trying to decide these things. But it's fascinating. Brad, there's another question here about cognitive dissonance, and I guess that has to do with the issue of preferring what you choose. Is that because you sort of, whether you explicitly or implicitly think it, you're thinking, but I chose it. I'm not an idiot. Why did I do this if it was a bad choice?
Yeah. In some ways, like I view what we're doing is sort of modernizing these old ideas from social psychology. I think that basic intuition is correct, that we have to, in some sense, explain our behavior to ourselves. The way I view it is that we like to be coherent. So one way to be coherent, of course, is to choose what you prefer, but you could also do it the other way around. Like, why is this in my, supermarket basket? Because I like it. It's like, so it's a way to sort of close that loop and be internally coherent. And so there could be a sense that there's a drive to like be like rational in that limited sense of being coherent, or it could be that we're just learning about ourselves in some sense from observing what we do. I mean, there's a lot of different takes on it. I mean, personally, I just think there's like a drive that people want to be coherent, and that's what's going on.
And there's a really good question here about whether or not any of these tools or programs that are available that can be used by small businesses to follow these kind of same data strategies that are available to the Facebooks and Tescos of the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so like a lot of the hands-on work was actually done by PhD students that had placements in these companies. But a lot of the tools to get this done a lot of them are open source, which means they don't cost any money to purchase. I mean, there's other costs involved in software besides purchasing. But a lot of even the systems that the servers people use are open source, like mostly Linux based. And there's cloud options if you need to compute a lot of data and you don't want to purchase hardware. You're not sure you're going to be running these analyses all the time. So I think it's hard and you need like some expertise, but you could get a long way without doing things that are, not that pretty simple, and they're not that sophisticated. Everything doesn't have to be like a complex, deep learning model or this or that. You could just with pretty much off the shelf machine learning packages, you could get somewhere. So I think if an organization was ramping up, um, it might not take a huge team to get some big early gains. I mean, just like anything, there's probably diminishing returns. We have to put more and more in to get more out on the end. But probably at first you could get somewhere without doing that much, and see if it's making you some money, whether you should invest more in that area.
And to just follow that up, because you mentioned that a lot of this work on the sharp end was done by PhD students, right? I mean, that tends to be a fairly cost-efficient way of hiring real cutting-edge expertise. So for companies that want to try to sponsor students to do some of this work, there are even government programs like what are called case studentships, which are half funded by the government, half funded by SMEs and things. So I do think that for companies who are interested, you shouldn't probably let the cost be the immediate deterrent. It's probably harder to find the right person and work with them than it is to actually fund this work, because it can be done at reasonable rates, which is...
Yeah, no, I agree 100% on that. You just need to hire the right person, and it doesn't have to be that costly in terms of the hardware, the tools, the software, and so on. It's really about having someone with the right expertise to at least get started for a smaller company.
Right. Now, there are a number of questions here that I should address relating to privacy, right? And they're basically all saying, but what about the privacy issues? How do we protect ourselves from the sort of invasiveness of all of this data collection about us?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a real serious concern, and it shouldn't be swept aside. One reason I was, like, for example, comfortable working with the Tesco data through dunnhumby was that, that's sort of, people know they're signing up for it. They know they're getting offers that are tailored to them. They want it to happen. So in a sense there, people are like, and of course we didn't know who the people were. They were just a number to us. So their privacy was all protected. And in the research, there's nothing like, addresses all that are just gone. So in that sense, the privacy was preserved. But of course, you are like sharing with the company things about you. But like that transaction seems like a little bit more ethical in that people know what's going on. They know they're giving up something about their privacy. They're getting something they think is a benefit in return. So it's it's sort of like a fair transaction. Other times, listeners are totally right. Like people will give up so much data to the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and they don't really know. They don't really know they're being tracked. Like, I didn't know I was being tracked when I bought my new trainers. And so, in some sense, it's a privacy issue, but maybe it's even a fairness issue, like economically, like, you're giving up something valuable and you're not really always getting something you want in return. So that, to me, seems a little bit of a gray area, which is, why we have these ever evolving privacy laws and regulations. And hopefully we're on pace to get it right. And I guess, on top of that, we just have to, be aware of what we're giving away and try to, control it where we find it sensitive or it bothers us. Yeah.
And I guess there's a take home there for consumers too, which is if you're getting something, odds are that the company is too, even if you aren't necessarily aware, and bet is it's probably data that you're giving them.
Yep. You're the product.
Absolutely. No, okay, that's fantastic. Well, Brad, I need to stop there because we're running out of time, and my apologies to everybody if I didn't get to your question. I would like to thank Brad Love, Professor of Cognitive and Decision Neurosciences, for your insights and helps today. It was really interesting and fascinating material. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It was a great discussion.
It's a real pleasure from my part. Next week, we're going to be talking about doing something a little bit different altogether. So still in real world, but we're going to be talking about live theater. There's a lot of discussion about the idea that live theater, live sports, and things like that are dead. And I think our professor, Daniel Richardson, who will be our guest next week, will take issue with that point. So please join us next week at the same time for the next episode of UCL's Changing Minds. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.